Hi, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I am Mary Jo Strobel, and I'm the Executive Director of the American Partnership for Eosinophilic Disorders. I am joined by representatives from partnering organizations that are co-hosting today's webinar. Kelly Barta from the Allergy and Asthma Network, Cindy Trubisky from the American Lung Association, and Sanaz Eftekhari, from the Asthma and Allergy Foundation of America. As most of you know, asthma is the most common chronic respiratory disease of childhood. It is the leading cause of emergency department visits and one of the top indications for hospitalizations in children. Researchers continue to develop and investigate new methods to prevent, treat, and manage asthma. Although options for patients with asthma have increased significantly over the past few years, there are still people for whom these options are not effective or accessible. In addition to questions surrounding therapies and disease management strategies, there's also a gap in public awareness and understanding of disease burden on young patients and their families. To help bridge this gap, the organizations that you see listed on the screen have come together to bring the voice of families impacted by pediatric asthma to the forefront of drug development and research through an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. This initiative is called Little Airways, Big Voices. I will soon be handing the meeting over to our speaker, Larry Bauer, who will walk us through externally led patient-focused drug development meetings and their impact. This initiative is an opportunity to share your story of living with pediatric asthma with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and other stakeholders. It doesn't matter where you live, where you are in your journey, what matters is your story. The primary goal of the meeting we will be hosting is to hear directly from patients and caregivers about their perspectives on living with pediatric asthma and their experience with treatments. This in turn will help improve the development of new drugs in the research pipeline. The patient perspective is critical in helping the FDA understand the context in which regulatory decisions are made for new drugs. I'd like to take a moment to express our deep gratitude for our sponsors, Sanofi Genzyme, Regeneron Pharmaceuticals, and Novartis, for their support in making this exciting and important initiative possible. Before we get underway, I want to cover a few housekeeping notes. We plan to end today at 4 p.m. We will be muting all lines to eliminate background noise, and we will post a recording of today's webinar on littleairwaysbigvoices.org in the coming days. We'll leave time for questions at the end. To ask a question at any time during the webinar, please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. I'd now like to introduce our guest speaker, Larry Bauer from Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara. Mr. Bauer is a senior regulatory drug expert with vast experience and knowledge of initiatives like Little Airways, Big Voices, and our collaborative is working with Larry and his associates to ensure our initiative has as big of an impact as it possibly can. Larry joins us today to talk about the process of drug development and to delve more into patient-focused drug development and why it's important. Thanks for being here, Larry. It's an honor to have you join us.
Thank you so much, Mary Jo. I appreciate the introduction. So I'd like to say welcome to all of you. We are so glad that you have joined us today for this webinar. This webinar is actually going to be an introduction to a meeting that will be happening on September 20th. But we'd like to give you some background today about the meeting and try to get, raise your excitement about attending the actual meeting. So well, before we start, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about my background. Prior to working with Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, I worked at the National Institutes of Health for 17 years, where I was involved in clinical research work. Then I moved over to the Food and Drug Administration, and I was there for 10 years. And at the Food and Drug Administration, I was called a regulatory scientist. And one of my biggest accomplishments there was being a co-founder of the Rare Diseases Program within the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. That was a special program that we started devoted to trying to develop treatments for people living with rare diseases and to try to speed up the drug development process. So in that role, I did a lot of work with patient advocacy groups, like the groups that you just saw on your screen. And I was also involved in the patient-focused drug development initiative, which we will talk about a little bit now. So Mary Jo started to explain a little bit about what is this meeting on September 20th? What is it all about? So the purpose of that meeting is going to be to educate the staff that work at the Food and Drug Administration. First of all, what is it like to live with pediatric asthma? How has pediatric asthma impacted your lives and the lives of those you love? We want to find out about the treatments you're using and how are you currently managing pediatric asthma? Are those treatments working or not working so well? And finally, what meaningful treatments might look like. As Mary Jo mentioned about the drug pipeline. The pipeline is where new products are being researched to see if they might be more helpful than what's existing. Next slide. So why should I participate in the meeting? This is a very unique opportunity to have your voices heard. The FDA staff will be taking the entire day to just be there to listen to you and learn from you. The FDA, as perhaps you know, they approve all new treatments for pediatric asthma. So it's critically important that the staff who work there, especially the review staff that review new treatments, they need to know and understand what is important to you and what would be important to your life. This knowledge that you share with them is going to impact their future decision making and hopefully is going to lead to better treatments and potentially faster new drug approvals for pediatric asthma treatments. Next. So why now? Why are we having this meeting now? So the patient's voice has historically been absent from the drug development process. In the past, the FDA would talk to drug sponsors, they would talk to scientists, maybe physicians, but there was one player in drug development whose voice was absent, and that's the voice of the patients. It's kind of a no-brainer that the people that will eventually be using the drugs, they should have one of the greatest voices in the approval of a new drug. So sometimes the FDA, they would not contact patient organizations until a drug was already approved. Sometimes if there were side effects, they wanted to understand how patients tolerated side effects or something like that. Or another time they would engage with patients was when a clinical trial was failing and either the drug company or FDA wanted input from actual patients to understand what the problems were. But what they've come to understand over the years is that they want patient voices to be heard at the beginning of the process of drug development, as well as throughout the entire continuum. You'll hear in just a few minutes, you'll hear about the drug development continuum. So you'll kind of see how this plays out. So stakeholder engagement, engaging with patients and caregivers has now become an FDA priority. And the FDA thought about it and they wanted to come up with a systemic way of capturing this kind of input from patients. So they started something called the Patient-Focused Drug Development Program. And this was a program to learn about disease impacts from patients as well as from caregivers. So the FDA started by having these one-day meetings with a variety of different disease groups. They found the process to be very successful, and we are modeling the meeting that we are going to have on September 20th after the same model that the FDA developed. But after doing 26 different diseases, the FDA realized that they could not hold these meetings for every single disease that was out there. There's over 10,000 different diseases, 7,000 rare diseases. So there was no way the FDA could do this. So they turned over the process to patient advocacy organizations and asked them to take the lead. So that's why this is called an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. It means that it's external to the FDA. The FDA has been guiding us in the process, giving us some advice about the meeting, but they are not technically sponsoring the meeting. They will, though, in the end, as you'll come to learn, they will be very interested in the findings and the results from the meeting. Next slide. So just to give you an overview of our talk today, first, I think it's important that everybody kind of starts with the same basic fundamental understanding of the Food and Drug Administration, as well as the process in which new drugs are developed. It's a fairly standardized process, and I think it's a great learning for anyone to understand the steps that are involved. We'll give you some more background on the FDA's patient-focused drug development program, and then we'll close as we get closer to the end with some things about your participation in the meeting, some logistics about the meeting, a little bit about the format, and tips for how you can participate on the actual day of the meeting. And we'll close, as Mary Jo said, we'll leave some time at the end for questions and answers, because I know this is a lot of information that we're sharing with you today. Next slide, please. Okay, so to start, we're going to talk about the background on FDA and drug development in general. Next slide. So the very initial thing when a new drug is being considered, this period is called drug discovery. So typically, researchers, scientists, academic institutions, they discover new drugs by looking at insights into the disease process that allow researchers to design a product to stop or reverse the effects of the disease. So they do an analysis of the pathways in the body that are disturbed, that maybe they can intervene to help show them where they can intervene. They might test many different molecular compounds to try to find a beneficial effects. And this could be, sometimes they test one compound for many different diseases. And sometimes they also want to know, with existing treatments that people are using, are there any unanticipated side effects from that treatment? And new technologies, such as those that provide new ways to target medical products to specific sites within the body, or to manipulate genetic material. So I'm sure you've all heard about gene therapy. This is a big area of drug development where they're actually studying how can they target a specific gene within the body that might be causing the problems that a person's experiencing with their disease. So once researchers identify a promising new compound, the development of that compound, it follows a very well-established path to make sure that they are safe and effective when they reach the public. Next slide. So I'm going to take you now through the phases of drug development. You'll see this arrow at the bottom. It starts and moves from left to right. We will talk about each of these phases, and this is the typical pattern that drugs go through as they are developed. So the first step is called preclinical development. And preclinical means exactly like it sounds. So before a drug is used in the clinic is where human beings go for treatment. Before it ever reaches that phase, this is the work that has to be done. So these are tests, initial tests of safety. Before they use any drug in a human being, they want to do some basic assessments of whether that drug might be used in human beings. And they want to find out if it's sufficiently effective against a disease target in chemical assay tests or perhaps animal models. I'm sure you've heard of the use of animal studies in they're called toxicology studies, so that they even can sometimes develop a model of a disease in an animal. So for instance, there's many different diseases that they've developed, what they call knockout mice, which are mice that have the same disease that you might see in a human being, so they can do initial drug testing in those mice to kind of get an idea about what the safety profile is of the new drug and what the side effects might be. The end result of the preclinical stage of development is something called an investigational new drug application, or IND. Next. So this is where we move to phase 1. This is the clinical development portion. We've got some basic safety information about the new drug, and the company developing the drug now is ready to move into human trials. So what they do is they submit this investigational new drug application to the FDA. In that submission, they have information about the pharmacology of the drug, so what chemicals are in it, the results of toxicology studies, so if there's any animal studies or lab studies that they've done on the drug. They submit information about the manufacturing of the product. It's very critical that the FDA understands how a drug is produced, and is the company able to always produce it the same way? You know, every time you go to the pharmacy and get your drug, you want to get the exact same thing that you got the time before. So the FDA, part of their role is to review this manufacturing information. They also review how long the drug can sit on the shelf before it goes bad. And then finally, they also look at the clinical protocols and the investigator information. So for every human study, you know, I'm sure some of you have participated in clinical research before, but there's a clinical protocol. The protocol outlines every step of the research study, what's going to happen when, what are the possible side effects that might happen, what will the investigators do if someone does develop a side effect, and that kind of information. So the goals of this stage of development, they continue to place emphasis on the drug safety. So they're always looking to see if there's any side effects or problems with the drug. They want to know what the most common side effects are. And then they also would like to find out information. How is this drug metabolized in your body and excreted? For instance, you know, some drugs we take orally, some drugs are topical where you put them on your skin and they're absorbed that way. Others are given IV or through an injection. So they want to understand just, you know, how this drug is entering your body and what it's doing. Then we move in the next phase of clinical development, which is phase 2. The primary goals of phase 2 are to, you know, in phase 1, we were still looking a lot at the safety data. Now we want to know, is the drug effective? They want to know if the drug works in people who have a certain disease. So in phase 1, sometimes that first initial safety study might be done with healthy volunteers. It doesn't always have to be people with the disease. But when we move to this phase 2, we want to definitely administer the drug to people with the disease of interest. Oftentimes, the drug is compared against placebo. This is a great scientific design for a study. When you give, you know, half the people in the study are given the drug, half the people are giving just a sugar cube or a sugar pill that looks like the drug, but the patients don't know, and the doctors administering it do not know which drug or placebo that the patient is getting. And so when they evaluate whether the drug is effective and what the side effects are, this kind of keeps the science very clean, that there's no bias, that the physician or the patients are not reporting thinking that they're getting the drug or thinking that they got the placebo. And then additionally at phase 2, we continue to monitor the short-term side effects of the drug and other safety issues. This phase of drug development is done with people in the disease, and it's a little bit larger, maybe like 10 to 40 people involved in phase 2. Once we have the data from phase 2 and that's submitted to the FDA, that's where we move to phase 3. Next slide, please. So in phase 3, this is the final phase of clinical development. So this is the final group of studies that are done in human beings. Traditionally, these are larger studies. They can be hundreds to thousands of people, depending upon the disease and the rarity of that disease. Once again, they continue to be a randomized trial where people might be on either placebo or the active drug. They continue at this stage to evaluate the effectiveness of the drug by measuring certain endpoints that the disease have. So, did we see a change in some certain aspect of the disease, and how great was that change? And did that change, does it seem like that change would be meaningful to people? They also want to know the duration of effect. So if someone takes a drug once a day, is that enough to maintain the effect that they're seeing, every day and for the entire day? They might also look at different populations. For instance, within asthma, I believe that there are different forms of asthma. There's allergy related, eosinophilic, different types. So they'd want to study a new drug for asthma, maybe in different subgroups of asthma, to see if it worked effectively in all of these groups. And then they also might want to study different dosages. One of the goals is drug developers want people to take the lowest dose possible to get the effect. So you might try, 3 or 4 different doses and to see if you get the same effect, or where is it that you get the best effect but the lowest dose. And once again, even at phase 3, we continue to collect safety data, including potential drug-drug interactions. When you start to give the drug to a larger group of people, people in the population are taking many different drugs, so you start to get more exposure to people that are taking the new drug plus maybe any other medication that they might be taking in their life. So they start to collect data about that. Next page. So after the completion of all those clinical studies, the preclinical work, all of that information, all of the data collected from all those studies is bundled together into something called an NDA or BLA submission. An NDA is a new drug application. A BLA is a biologics licensing application. New drugs tend to be more like pills, those kinds of things, solid substances. Biologics tend to be things like blood products, vaccines, gene therapies, those kinds of things that are more biologic in nature. So the FDA holds a meeting with the drug company. It's called a pre-NDA or pre-BLA meeting. At this meeting, they kind of review all of the data. What's the company going to submit? They want to make sure that everything is there, because once they submit this data, a clock starts. There's a 10-month clock to review a new drug, and they want to make sure that everything's there when they start their review. They asked the drug company to identify the pivotal studies. So which studies did the company do that really showed that this drug worked? They want to discuss the methods of statistical analysis. So, to find out, how do we prove that the drug was effective by doing a statistical study? And then they want to uncover any major unresolved issues that might be outstanding. And this NDA submission to the FDA, it includes all the information collected up to this point. So the company sends in all their animal data, all their human data, their chemistry data, the manufacturing data. This is the final bundle that's sent to the FDA for their review. And this is, at this point, this FDA review is the final step before a new drug reaches the marketplace. So before it reaches the pharmacy and your doctor is able to prescribe the new drug to you. So this is a critical step. The FDA is the last, checkpoint in this process before a drug gets made available on the market. Next. And once that the FDA review starts, they look at whether the application is complete. When they get it, they assign a review team to evaluate the application. This includes people that are physicians, toxicologists, chemists, all these people. They put together a team to be the review team. And the FDA, sorry about that. We're having a lightning storm in Charlottesville. And my dog doesn't. Hazel. Okay, sorry about that. So the FDA assesses whether the effectiveness has been demonstrated for the drug's proposed use. They assess whether the safety assessment's adequate to conclude that the drug is safe. In other words, do the benefits outweigh the risks? And they want to know whether the manufacturing methods and the controls used to maintain the product quality are adequate. Sometimes they also have an advisory committee. So if they have some questions, sometimes they put together a committee outside of the FDA to kind of help them in their review process. Next step. Next slide. So once the drug is approved, the FDA's involvement does not end there. There's a phase called the post-market safety surveillance phase. When a new drug is approved, there's only limited knowledge about how it affects people. We don't really learn about a drug until hundreds or thousands of people have taken it. There might be a rare side effect that only certain people get. So new safety information often emerges after the product is used in this larger population. And the FDA maintains an active program in post-marketing safety surveillance to monitor adverse events. So when people have adverse events to drugs, either the doctor or them can report these to the FDA. Next slide. So what is FDA's role? Next slide. So just a couple things to help clarify. People don't always understand what the FDA does and doesn't do. So the FDA themselves does not develop new drugs. New drug development happens through researchers, pharmaceutical companies, and nonprofit groups. They do disease research as well as the drug development. Additionally, FDA does not test drugs in clinical trials. So the Food and Drug Administration does not run the clinical trials. The FDA staff are not on site at the clinical trial site. So these are often in hospitals or clinics. The FDA is not present. But researchers conducting human trials must seek FDA approval before beginning these studies. Next slide. Another thing about the practice of medicine and drug costs. The FDA does not have the authority to regulate the practice of medicine. Now, what this means is that FDA regulates the development and marketing of medical products, but once that drug is approved and on the market and available in the pharmacy, your physician is free to prescribe any FDA-approved drug for any condition that they want, even if it's not in the label and it's not what the drug was studied for. This is known as off-label use because we say it's off-label because it's not part of the approved FDA label. This happens sometimes physicians have some understanding of a disease process and they have an idea that a drug that's approved might help in a condition, and they are free to try to administer that to a person to see if it will help them. FDA doesn't regulate the price of medicine either. So the consideration of how much a drug costs is not part of the FDA's mandate. FDA cannot base an approval decision based on a drug price. So once that NDA or BLA submission comes to the FDA has no idea, the review staff, on what the eventual cost of this drug is. And as we know, the range is astronomical. From a drug can be very expensive for, pennies to, dollars, up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the FDA has nothing to do with pricing the drug, and they are not aware when they do their review what the drug will eventually cost. Next. Now, one of the things that FDA's mission does include is promoting public health. FDA has many different programs to try to promote public health and to provide education about drugs. The FDA reviewers have expert knowledge on drug development and clinical trials. So all the people reviewing drugs at the FDA have had specialized training. FDA provides technical help to researchers and drug developers. They help companies design clinical trials and studies. And during that drug development process where you saw all the different phases, the FDA has numerous meetings with companies throughout that process where they can, so that the FDA doesn't just see all the information at the end of the process. They kind of help all the way through it. Next. So for more information on the FDA regulation of medical products, as well as other ways to get involved, here is a URL that you could go to find out more information. Next slide, please. So now we're going to get into the weeds a little bit about more specifically. That was kind of general about the FDA and drug development. Now we're going to talk a little bit about patient-focused drug development, which is the meeting that's going to be happening for your community. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, FDA wanted a more systematic way to gather the patient perspective about different conditions and different treatment options. They wanted this information to help them understand the context for benefit risk assessment and decision making for new drugs. That's basically what they're trying to evaluate in a review is, do the benefits of a new drug, do they outweigh the risks? So there's more benefit than there are problems or safety issues. And patient input, it helps the FDA during drug development and the review of an application for marketing a new drug. Next slide. So this is just a little bit more about that benefit risk assessment that I was just speaking of. So for every new drug that's evaluated, this is the exact framework that the FDA uses to evaluate the drug. The first thing is the analysis of the condition. So what are the symptoms of the disease? How does the disease affect people? What are the worst symptoms of the disease that people experience? And secondly, they want to know about what are the current treatment options. So what's available to people already? Part of the reason they want to know what's available, because if it's a disease that has nothing available, there's no approved drugs for that disease, they might be more flexible or more open to considering, how effective this drug was, just because they want to make something available for the community that so far has nothing. Or if the treatments that are available, if they have a lot of side effects, or maybe those treatments are by injection or IV, but then if a company comes up with something that you can take by mouth, that's a big improvement over treatment. And then these last three categories, the benefits of the drug, the risks, and how to manage those risks, all of that information comes from the clinical study results on the effectiveness of the drug, the safety of the drug, and how do you manage side effects. Next slide, please. So now specifically about our meeting, this is going to be the Pediatric Asthma Voice of the Patient meeting. This meeting is a framework to discuss questions that came from FDA's benefit risk framework, and it represents important considerations in their decision making. We reviewed this and other disease area questions, and we tailored our agenda and our panel questions to try and communicate the most important information related to pediatric asthma. The FDA has emphasized to us that active patient involvement and participation is the key to the success of these meetings. So I want to reiterate, thank you again for joining this webinar and for joining and getting involved in the meeting. Next. At the end of the meeting, there will be a final product developed. This will be a report. It's called the Voice of the Patient report. This is a summary document, and it will contain caregiver, patient, and audience testimony, as well as information and data from polling. We will do live polling on the day of the meeting, as well as submitted written comments. This document becomes a key communication to FDA review staff and the regulated industry about what patients and caregivers most want to see in a treatment. It's so important that we develop this Voice of the Patient report because, every single reviewer at the FDA that maybe works on asthma drugs. Maybe everybody's not available on the day of the meeting, but they will be able to come back to this report and read the findings of what we discuss on that day. FDA wants this information. It informs them about ways to develop meaningful treatments for pediatric asthma. And this document will live, it will be available on all the websites of the organizing organizations, as well as there will be a link eventually on the FDA's website as a resource for anyone looking to find out and learn more about pediatric asthma. So now just a little bit about how can you participate in the meeting. Okay, so who is this meeting for? It's definitely for pediatric asthma patients and their caregivers, and definitely for the FDA review staff. We also want pharmacologic companies and biotech companies to be there and learn, and anyone interested in learning. For example, if you have family members that don't understand asthma, if your physician, maybe your family physician wanted to learn more about asthma, you can send the link to register to anyone. This is a public open meeting. It will take place on September 20th. We'll start at 10 o'clock in the morning and it will finish at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There'll be a half-hour break for lunch about midday. It's a virtual meeting, so people can attend from anywhere. One of the benefits of having virtual meetings is that we've had participation in other patient-focused drug development meetings from people all over the world. And we even have people calling in and sending in comments from all over the world. So it's kind of really opened up and broadened the scope of these meetings. And the meeting is going to be an interactive meeting that I'll tell you a little bit more about. Next slide. So this is just to give you an idea about what the agenda will be on the day of the meeting. We will open the meeting with a welcoming and some introductory comments from the meeting co-moderator. As well, we've invited a physician from the Food and Drug Administration who will give some opening remarks. Next, we've invited a pediatric asthma expert to give everyone a background on pediatric asthma and clinical trials. The purpose of this talk is to give everyone attending at least a basic scientific understanding of pediatric asthma. It's kind of so we're all starting from the same basic information before we hear from patients and caregivers. After we hear the clinical overview, the rest of the day will be broken into two topics. The first topic is how does pediatric asthma symptoms, how do those symptoms affect your life? What are the primary symptoms you have and how do they affect you? And then the second half of the day will be how you manage those symptoms and current and future approaches to treatment. Each of these topics will begin with pre-recorded patient panels. We've invited 5 people for each panel to give a 5-minute talk that they will pre-record before the meeting. We also have polling questions and a moderated discussion with the audience. The meeting will end with a meeting summary of the day, as well as then some closing remarks. Next slide. Next, please. So what are the questions that we're actually going to discuss? So for topic 1, living with pediatric asthma, disease symptoms and daily impacts. These are some of the questions you can begin thinking about. So when we get to the discussion period, we're going to ask of all the symptoms of pediatric asthma, which 1 to 3 symptoms have the most significant impact on your life? And then secondly, how does pediatric asthma affect you or maybe your child if you're a caregiver on best and on worst days? Describe the best days and the worst days for us. And then thirdly, are there specific activities that are important to you that you cannot do at all, or maybe not as fully as you would like because of pediatric asthma? Next slide. As we continue on this topic of symptoms, we're going to ask you how your symptoms have changed over time. So has the course of asthma been steady, or has it shifted, either getting better or getting worse? And how has your ability to cope with symptoms changed over time? Another thing that we're going to ask is, what do you fear most as either you or your loved one gets older? What worries you most about this condition, and what frustrates you most about this condition? Next slide. Then we're going to shift gears a little bit in the afternoon after lunch. We're going to go to topic 2, and we're going to discuss questions related to current challenges to treating pediatric asthma. Some of these questions are, what are you currently doing to manage your pediatric asthma symptoms? So this could be medical treatments, it could be things like acupuncture, diet, exercise, or not exercising. We want to know how well these symptoms treat the most significant aspects of pediatric asthma. And then what are the most significant downsides to your current treatments, and how do they affect your daily life? So are there any issues with the treatments that you take, and how do they affect you? And then lastly, of course, everybody would like to see a complete cure for asthma, but short of a complete cure, what specific things would you look for in an ideal treatment for pediatric asthma? What symptoms of asthma would you most like to see a new treatment being developed for? Next. So the discussion format, this is just a little bit more about what the day is going to look like. So as I mentioned before, there'll be a panel of pre-recorded patients for each of these topics. The purpose of these panelists is to set the foundation for the broader audience discussion that will follow their testimonies. We selected panelists to try to reflect a range of experience with the condition. There's no way we could cover everything. That's why once we're done with the pre-recorded panelists, we're going to ask patients in the audience and online to answer polling questions. The purpose of these polling questions is a starting off point for further discussion. And the way that you'll participate in the polling is that you'll take out your cell phone. There'll be a link on the screen on the day of the meeting. It's very easy to click into the polling, and the questions will just show up on your telephone. We ask that patients and caregivers only respond to the questions, because we really want the responses to the polling questions to be the voice of the patients and caregivers. Once we have done some of that information and collected that information, we're also going to do some demographic polling. Are you someone with asthma? Are you a parent? Are you male, female? Where do you live? That kind of information, just to know who's at the meeting. And then finally, we'll move to a discussion with patients in the audience. And the purpose of this discussion is to build on the experiences already shared by the panel. The moderator for the meeting, which is my colleague James Valentine, will start asking questions. And we ask that you submit responses either in writing. There'll be an email address you can send in a response, or preferably, we hope that as many of you as possible can call in on the telephone live on the day of the meeting. Once again, the phone number will be on the top of your screen, and it will be very easy to think about the question being addressed and to call in and actually become part of the meeting. Next slide. Oh, there we are. Okay. So a few tips for how can you effectively participate in the meeting. We ask that you remember FDA's role and the purpose of the meeting. The purpose is to learn about asthma. It's not, we're not there to criticize the FDA or to talk about how expensive new drugs are or anything like that. We hope that you can review each of these discussion questions in advance to maybe start thinking about what you might like to contribute. And if you have something important to share, try to relate it to the most appropriate topic or panel question that was just proposed by the moderator, and then pick up your phone and call in. It's so important that we have as many people as possible call in. And we just want to let you know too, it's okay to reiterate a feeling or experience that somebody already voiced, even if it's similar to your own, but give it a personal or unique perspective. Sometimes when we hear something again and again, it shows us that, wow, this is really an important symptom that people are talking about. We ask that you try to keep your comments concise and focused. There are many voices to be heard on the day of the meeting. So we want to hear from as many different people as possible so that this meeting, really is comprehensive in its scope. And it's important to know too, you can always send in additional comments after the meeting. we will keep the website open for 30 days after the meeting, where if you think of something afterwards and say, oh, I should have brought up that point, you can still write those kind of comments in. You can participate in the meeting by webcast, as we talked about. Your responses will be kept confidential. We might use someone's first name and then, what they said. Here is some information about registering for the meeting. Go to this URL address, Little Airways bigvoices.org, and you can start to sign up. As I mentioned, we're going to take comments for 30 days after the meeting. And even these comments that come in after the meeting, we will still try to include as many of those as possible in the voice of the patient report. So don't think that even if you add something after the actual meeting, that it's not important. It is. Next slide. So in summary, this is your opportunity to be part of the process. Please know you can have a meaningful impact on clinical trial design and drug development for new treatments for pediatric asthma. Your collective voices must be heard at the beginning of the process to help companies design trials and studies that will meet your needs, and to help the FDA review staff assess the risks and benefits with a full and complete understanding of the impact of pediatric asthma and the patient perspective. So please join us on September 20th and help make a difference. Your contribution is not just going to help you, but it will help many, many people with asthma all over the country and maybe even all over the world. Next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. Okay, so at this point in the meeting, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Sanaz Eftekhari, who's going to coordinate some questions. Please send in any questions that you might have. We talked about a lot of different things. So, Sanaz.
Gary, thanks so much for the great presentation. So we've got a few questions that have come in, and if you guys have any more, please feel free to send them into the questions box. We have about 13 minutes left. So Larry, I think the first question is a good one for you. Somebody wanted to know, how does the FDA, or how has the FDA used the information gathered at PFDD meetings in the past? How have they used it in their work?
They use it very specifically. For instance, a new kind of controversial drug was just developed for Alzheimer's disease that the studies were kind of iffy. Alzheimer's disease has very few, almost no good treatments. And the FDA really listened to the patient voice. And the patients, people living with Alzheimer's disease, said, please let us try this. We want to try this drug, even though it's expensive. And the FDA, they took a lot of heat and criticism for approving it, but they went ahead and approved the new drug. Another time when this, we had a patient-focused drug development meeting for a rare disease called epidermolysis bullosa, where people are born with large areas of their skin missing. It's horrific. They get horrible infections and die at young ages. The FDA had a guidance that said any new treatment that would heal a skin disease had to completely close the wound. The patients from this community said, no, even if you can shrink it, it will make a huge difference to us because we don't have to put as many bandages on and that kind of thing. And so the FDA came back and they changed. They changed how they approve drugs for skin treatments now. And now for this community, even if it just improves the size of the wounds that they have, the FDA is willing to consider approving a new drug. So they actually use very specifically what they learn.
Oh, that's great to hear. Another question about the FDA process. So from the time a drug is in phase 1 or even preclinical, assuming it has, I guess, smooth sailing through all the processes, about how long does it typically take to get the drug to market?
That's a great question. I think typically it takes 5 to 10 years. That's why, people are criticizing the FDA about the vaccine approval process, that nothing's been fully approved yet. But this has been record speed on the FDA's part to get a new vaccine, go through, the initial phases and let people use it. But because typically each of those steps takes a long time, especially the clinical trials. clinical trials can take anywhere from a few months to a few years. So, and then you've got to analyze the data. So it's often a lengthy process.
Yeah, but I think I agree. I've heard a lot about people being surprised when they hear about how long the FDA process really is.
Yeah.
Another question for this PFDD meeting, and I'll open it up to Larry or any of the co-hosts here. Would it be more helpful to hear from a pediatric patient or teenager, or from their caregiver, or from both? Or does it help to have both perspectives?
Does someone want to jump in?
I think Larry, you got it.
I'll go ahead then. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Larry.
Yeah, I think it's best. We want to hear from both. We love it. If somebody's a teenager or a younger person and they feel like that they've got the the self, whatever to answer a question themselves, we'd love to hear directly. But we want to hear from their parent as well, because sometimes a parent might observe something differently than a child, and that can be just as valid. So we would like to hear from you both.
The diagnosis really does impact the whole family, and everybody has different perspectives with it. So it is valuable to include 360 view if you're able to.
Yep.
Okay, great. And I'm just looking through some of these questions. What about if a child's asthma is well controlled? Is the FDA only looking to hear from people whose asthma is not controlled, or do they want to hear from anyone who's anywhere in the journey?
I think we want to hear from everyone's experience. Sometimes hearing what's worked, that's good information for the FDA to know that there's a certain part of the population, and maybe by one person saying that I tried this and this is what really works and controls for me, might trigger somebody else calling in and say, I tried that too, but it didn't work for me. And by all of these different voices contributing to the conversation, we're going to help paint a very full picture. And just because we hear from one person, that's one person's experience, not the collective. It's an amazing day when you start to really hear all these different voices. It's unlike any other meeting for asthma that you will ever attend probably in your life.
While Sanaz looks up another question, I have one that I will pitch to you, Larry. For patients that are participating and calling in on day of, afterwards, we have a website where we're collecting additional testimony through survey. Would they be encouraged to do both? So if they were able to share some perspective live after the event, if they, as you mentioned, have something additional to add, would that be the place to do it?
Absolutely. People will have, there's several different roles that people will have on the day of the meeting. So we'll have pre-recorded panelists. But even if someone's a pre-recorded panelist, they might think of something after the meeting, that they could write in. Or if like someone's a panelist for panel 1, maybe they, when we get to the other panel 2, maybe they have something they want to telephone in and discuss about treatments. So we encourage everyone to use all of the different, ways of participating. And once again, to encourage as many of you as possible to participate in the polling on the day of the meeting and calling in. So, yep.
Thank you. We've got a few questions about the role of school nurses, and I'm wondering, would this be a type of meeting that school nurses, because they care for obviously the children in schools, would it be a meeting that they would participate in at all or provide any perspectives, or how does the FDA handle those other types of caregivers outside of parents and guardians?
That's a very good question. It's going to be really tempting for people like physicians and school nurses and care deliverers to want to be part of this, but that's what makes this day so unique. We actually are going to discourage them from participating, even though they might have some information. I mean, I suppose a school nurse could, maybe if they wanted to write in a comment, after the meeting, but we really want this, the title of the document at the end is the voice of the patient report. So this is really, there's other, ways that a school nurse maybe could share things about asthma, or that physicians or scientists, they have lots of, scientific conferences and that kind of thing. This day is devoted completely to patients and caregivers. So.
Yep, and that's not to take away at all from the importance of school nurses and helping to manage asthma, but for this particular meeting for the FDA, there really is a focus on pediatric patients and their caregivers.
Yes. Yeah,
So
school
with
nurses, we've heard, when preparing some of the panelists, we know that the school nurse has played a critical role for some children in their asthma. So we thank them, and actually encourage your school nurse. If your school nurse has been part of asthma care for your child, encourage them, if they have the time, to tune in to any part of the day. You don't have to be there from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. for the entire day. If you can do the morning session, or if you could do just the discussion for one of the panels, you can come in and out as you like during the day.
Yeah, and I think that's important to note. I apologize. Important to note that anyone can view and watch the meeting, but we'd like the participants to be largely patients and caregivers. I'm sorry, Cindy, did I cut you off?
No, that's okay. I was just going to add on to Larry's comment and loop around to Mary Jo's comment, is that, if you can't come for the whole day, certainly there are other ways to also add your voice in the different ways, coming back to the website, providing a comment, providing a full statement on a different topic that you may not have been able to attend live. So calling in and putting your voice in, your opinions in now or 30 days after the event as well, because you thought of something at 2 o'clock in the morning and, oh, that would work. So we do welcome all the different ways of engagement.
That's a good point, Cindy. I forgot to mention that when people go to register, they'll be able to send in some comments early, even before the meeting, as well as after it. So, yeah.
Okay, and I think that wraps up a lot of the questions that we can answer here. Again, this recording will be available, and we'll follow up with some of the other questions that we weren't able to get to. And with that, I would love to thank everyone for attending. Larry, thank you so much for this really informative presentation. A big thank you to my co-hosts here, and to our sponsors as well. And we will do a follow-up as soon as the recording is available to share. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye now.